was going to introduce everyone, but you feel free to. Mine's pretty like simple. Regina Shands Stoltzfus, Tobin Miller Shearer. I'm from Central Pennsylvania. My last name is Brubaker, so I got it. I got it. Good evening, everyone. If we want to find our way to our seats, we're about to get started here. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Thank you for joining us in Harrisburg. We're happy you're here, and we hope you enjoy tonight's event with Regina Shands Stoltzfus and Tobin Miller Shearer and Drew Hart. Before we begin, I have some quick housekeeping notes. As always, one, we are early in our event series for 2024, and we've announced many more authors scheduled into the new year. One that I'd like to flag is for tomorrow. We'll be hosting award-winning poet Kaveh Akbar for his debut novel, Martyr. The book has received rave reviews from the New York Times, Washington Post, and is one of the most anticipated novels of the year. Additionally, take an events flyer as you leave, and stay tuned to our social media pages, website, and e-newsletter for event updates. Two, we have copies of Been in the Struggle available for purchase tonight at the cafe, as well as Drew's books, and they are sticking around for a book signing after the event. A quick reminder that book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our author event series, and each purchase helps to support the bookstore, the authors, and the future of our programming, so we encourage you to come away with a book this evening. At this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our authors are Regina Shands Stoltzfus. Regina teaches at Goshen College in the Religion, Justice, and Society Department. She is co-founder of the Roots of Justice Anti-Oppression program and has worked widely in peace education. She holds a Master of Arts degree in Biblical Studies from Ashland Theological Seminary and a PhD in Theology and Ethics from Chicago Theological Seminary. She's the author of 2 previous books, and her many articles have appeared in publications such as Sojourners and The Mennonite. She has also written for the Anabaptist Historian's blog. Our other co-author here is Tobin Miller Shearer. Tobin is co-founder with Regina Shands Stoltzfus of the Roots of Justice Anti-Oppression program and an award-winning professor of history and African American studies at the University of Montana. He is the author of 5 books and more than 100 articles. His work has appeared in publications such as the Chicago Tribune, Conspire, and Anabaptist Historians. He blogs at Truth and Grace. Of course, lastly, our interviewer this evening is Drew Hart. Drew is a public theologian and professor of theology at Messiah University. He has 10 years of pastoral ministry experience and is a recipient of multiple awards for peacemaking. Hart attained his MDiv with an urban concentration from Mizio Seminary and his PhD in theology and ethics from Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. He is the author of 2 books, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, and Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Of course, the book we're here for this evening is titled Been in the Struggle, Pursuing an Anti-Racist Spirituality. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from David Evans, who writes, quote, "This passionately written book is a must-read for anyone who desires to go beyond simple platitudes about racism and find spiritual nourishment for the struggle," end quote. We're very honored to welcome Regina, Tobin, and Drew to Harrisburg. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be interviewing Regina and Tobin. I've known each of them for, I don't know exactly how, I feel like we're moving towards 10 years, but maybe not that long, I'm not sure. But I'm really excited to have a conversation around their book, Been in the Struggle. And to get us started, thinking about you two writing this book is interesting. You know, I had a friend who used to joke a little bit about some of like the racial reconciliation genre books, and it would always be like a white pastor and a black pastor, both men, and my friend called it the bromance kind of genre, right? as they worked through their issues, and it's all about like their interpersonal issues and how they kind of found their way at the end. But I feel like you all are doing something very different in this book, and so hopefully we can kind of get into why this is a little different than maybe that bromance, racial reconciliation genre. But I am also curious. I mean, you all live in different regions and states. Maybe not everyone necessarily knows that much about your story, but you know, it is not inevitable that you two would be working together to write Been in the Struggle. So what brings you as a black woman, you as a white man, to be writing this book together?
All right, thank you all for being here tonight. This is so awesome to see all of your faces here. I think first and foremost, we have a long-standing friendship. We met each other when we were both working for the same agency back in the mid-90s, and we both happened to be, have jobs where the door was open for us to be thinking about the work that we do, anti-racism work, within the context, at that time, primarily faith communities, and we were both looking for people to be in those conversations with. And the mid-90s was we were still in that era that was probably pretty much 80s of racial reconciliation and all sorts of other language that seemed to us to sort of speak around what we also should be talking about. And so, again, hungry for a conversation, and that's the context in which our friendship began.
Yeah, and I also just want to thank you all for being here. It's a delight to be in Harrisburg. I think the thing I would add about our relationship, it began seeking out a co-struggler. I think some of those bromances you talk about seek out the relationships for the point of the relationship, that's the reason, where I think our relationship emerged out of a struggle to a larger end. And I think that's the frame that we tried to put our relational story in this book as well. Often when we work with groups, particularly congregations, this first round of questions are about, well, how do we bridge relational gaps? How do we become, if it's a white congregation, how do we become more colorful? And we found ourselves saying, well, that's the wrong question. It's how do you prepare yourselves for being agents of change in the world around you, and then those relationships are going to emerge if you do it with authenticity and intentionality. And I think that's been part of our story as well.
I would also say that one of the clear strengths and blessings that supported us being able to become good friends and also do the work that we started doing at that time was we had a remarkable cohort of colleagues there with us, and some of you know who some of those folks were. And so it was a very fertile ground, and so I think there's something about the timing of how we came to know one another, and some folks that we still have pretty strong relationships with, both in terms of doing anti-racism work, but also in terms of just like who we like to hang out with.
I was thinking in preparation for this, I was thinking about like when I first met each of you and what I associate. And I remember Regina, I don't know when I can't remember when. I guess Regina just was, right, at some point in my life. But I do remember she invited me. I came to Goshen College for MLK Day, and I spoke that day. But I remember that you were receiving an award that day for all the community work that you had been involved in, and just how affirming they were in recognizing just the deep impact that you had in that region and in that community. And the other thing that came to mind was when I spoke at Mennonite conference or whatever, and there was some kind of issue going on, and I think some frictions among some of the black Mennonites there. and you were rounding people up and saying like, no, 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 this is not what's going down. And I think both of those are a testimony to the work that you've put in, the relationships that you've had. And I think that kind of communal affirmation is a testimony to the way that you've been at this for a while and have been recognized by that. And then for Tobin, I met him first through the scholarship interested in Vincent Harding, right? And the witness of Vincent Harding and the ongoing work that he had as a friend of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And then out of that have blossomed and connected in a whole bunch of spheres, both academically, but also partnering. And I really appreciate the multifaceted way that both of you are not just scholars, but like actually seeking justice, have been doing anti-racism work literally for decades, so that when we have a title like Been in the Struggle, it actually reflects, you know, lives that have been committed to this work for so long. So why this particular book though right now? Like what made you all feel like it's time to put some pen to paper?
Well, part of it came to us in, we had an invitation to write this from Herald Press, but very quickly as we got to talking about what we might write, it was clear that we had a joint story to tell. Both of us have written a number of books, and it's very clear to me that this was by far the least laborious writing process, even though it was done, I mean, I think anyone who's tried to co-author, it's often more work to co-author than to write by yourself, but that was not true here. We'd meet once a week, talk about it, and from invitation to editing, it was about a year, which was just lightning speed, at least at our writing, my writing pace.
We came in before deadline.
We did. We came in before deadline.
Only time in my life, though.
Want to say anything about the larger context?
Yeah, we were invited to write a book, and as we have done often over the years, because we have never lived in the same city, never lived in the same state, and but over the years we've collaborated on a number of things, whether it's writing shorter pieces or doing workshops or doing some sort of training. And the pattern pretty much always is one of us will get either a phone call or an email, or if it's an email, it'll come to both of us at the same time. And I think that was the case with this. And before we respond, we're like texting each other, like, what do you think? What do you think? And I think that from the very moment it was a clear yes. I don't think we wavered, either of us wavered a bit of it. And it was because, you know, we've been through some stuff, some good things and some harder things. And it seemed important to honor the journey that we have been on with a number of communities in the US and Canada, but also to honor the work that we have tried to do well in doing anti-racism work and anti-oppression work more broadly speaking, but also to do work that is rather trying often, and to know that even when we have moments when we are not in agreement with one another, that we know that it's fine, we're going to come out okay.
And I think a particular dynamic of the story we wanted to tell with this book was trying to thread the needle in a way that would not make monsters of those we had been in conflict with, and also we attempted not to engage in a story of self-aggrandizement at the same time. I mean, to be authentic about the storytelling, but not to create caricatures in the process. And I think that was a tension throughout the telling of the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of a couple of times where we would tell a story and times where we chose not to tell certain stories because the people involved would have been readily recognizable, and that was not the point of why we were telling stories.
So I know that the process of doing this anti-racism work, especially in Christian spaces and church spaces, has not always been easy, that you guys have navigated many obstacles and have many challenges. And I know I often say, like, I stand on the shoulders of folks who've been doing this work for way longer and have been able to go into other spaces after the fact, right? And probably have had less friction precisely because of that. But nonetheless, you all have chosen, I mean, the subtitle, Pursuing an Anti-Racist Spirituality. So it's written to people of faith, especially to the church, with a Christian framework. One, what is an anti-racist spirituality? Because isn't racism just a social, how is it a spirituality? So help us out with that. And how is your faith shaping kind of how you approach thinking about anti-racism?
One of the things that I am very grateful for is the congregation that I was raised and nurtured in. It continues to be predominantly African American Mennonite congregation in Cleveland, Ohio. It was more interracial when I was coming up. And I had, throughout my entire childhood and teenage years, models of adults who were from different racial backgrounds who said, we are church together. And I learned a lot of things after I was an adult, and I pastored in that church for 7 years. I learned a lot about what it cost for people to do what they did for those of us that came up in that church. And so for me, my default has been that my understanding of my faith is to be a Christian is to look at issues like racism and other systems of oppression and say, this we are called to be living differently, speaking differently, and acting differently around this. And it's more than just like being friends with each other. It is working through things together for a future that we are able to imagine because of our faith narrative. So for me, that it has always been like, what else would we be doing? What else would, now, coming out of that context, I realized, oh, everyone doesn't think like that. Okay. And that was a bit startling for me, but I'm really grateful for that foundation.
Thanks, Regina. I think I have two responses to your question, Drew. One is more historical, one more personal. Charles Lippy and other historians argue that the practice of slavery in this country had as one of its many effects of essentially creating a new religion that divorced salvation from social transformation. And I was talking with a UCC church 2 weeks ago on this topic, and my argument to them was that those of us who even think that we're sort of on the leading edge of progressivism around an issue like racism are still bearing the legacy of that split. And that I think we are poor in our theological language about how we engage with systems of power and privileging. So one of the things I think we're trying to do in this book is to reclaim that as central to, for us in the Christian tradition, that is part of who we are. And so we need to put the label of anti-racism, spirituality back on it because it has been divorced from it. So that's the more historical answer. The personal one is, for all my struggles with my faith community, that's my people, those are my people, and that's my language. And that's how I know to speak with the greatest degree of authenticity to the people I care most about and with whom I have had the most struggles. And so that brings me to that story as well.
So, and pretty earlier on in your book, you all just clarify why you use certain language and not other language, why you don't always use BIPOC, maybe occasionally, but not all the time, and particularly around this idea of centering blackness and anti-blackness and taking that seriously. Can you talk a little bit about how blackness shapes church and society, and why it's so important to take that so seriously in thinking about a kind of anti-racist spirituality?
Susan Thistlethwaite, I always have a hard time saying her last name, Thistlethwaite, makes the argument that race in society turns on a black-white axis. And that's not to suggest that other racial identities are in any way less important, but our notions of race itself, the systems of power and privilege, for most of our national experience has been worked out on that dynamic. And so that becomes, I think, a foundational starting point for any extended conversations we're going to have about the way racism is played out in society. Again, not that that's more important than the Latinx or indigenous experiences, Pacific Islander, Asian American, but there's been a foundational, formative notion of what racism is and how it operates that makes that story of blackness so important.
And I think that we can see through just the emergence of how we talk about race in this country, the immigration stories of many groups that have come over, this sense of who are you going to align yourself with, right? And so naming anti-blackness historically and contemporarily as something that exists, that we can look at our history, we can look at laws, we can look at specific instances where the language of black and white comes into play, often for that purpose of, figure out who you're going to align yourself with, used as a wedge, right, for some of those immigrant groups. You see how that group gets treated. You don't want to get treated like that, so come on over to this side. The other thing that I think about in response to other parts of your question, the language around race, the language around racialized groups, the language around any social identities. Language is fluid, right? And it's changing. And I think that in any given moment when we are speaking about it or writing about it, we do need to sort of pick some terms and then say, here's why we are using these terms. And then when we were writing, it seems to me that was about the time we were seeing more and more of the use of the term BIPOC. And I became aware that I was seeing it in two different ways, meaning black, indigenous, people of color, black people of color, indigenous, or black, indigenous, and other people of color, which was a more expanded way of saying people of color, right? Just being more specific. And that just sort of made me a little grouchy because when it got used and I wasn't sure how people were using it, it made me grouchy because the one that if I use it, I will name, I'm talking about black and indigenous people of color on this landmass because those are the two groups that have a very specific history in this country, as to Tobin's point, not to discount any other groups, but those two histories are so very specific to the nation building project that it needs some pretty precise language.
Thank you. So, you know, I know we're already pressing on time, so there's just so much good stuff, right? Which is why if you haven't bought it yet, you're just gonna need to get it. But so instead of getting into the weeds of all the different things, at one point you guys do talk about 3 foundational practices for working across racial lines, and you talk about the process of grieving, veto power to people of color, and remembering that we are more than the work, right? I don't know if you all want to just say a little bit more. I mean, so for those that are maybe looking to do more than just have relationships, right, across racial lines, but want to join the struggle, what do you mean by those 3 things? Process of grieving, veto power to people of color, and that we are more than the work.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you reminded us what we wrote there, because I couldn't have come up with that.
What did we say?
Yeah, once you said it, I did try to reread the book on the plane today, but I missed that part. So
I know how this works. You got to be reminded of your own work. I know this.
So I think the thing that is often I get the most questions about is the working principle that we've operated on for the 30 years we've worked together of Regina having veto power. It's been an important practice and principle to live out the ideas that we are trying to promote in when we talk with groups. And there have been maybe a handful of times that we've actually sort of said, okay, this is a point we're at an impasse, Regina gets the final word. But it's been a good grounding practice, I think, particularly for me as a white male who's been socialized as to being the one who has the last word and is the one who's the authority in the room, to know that that's not going to be the case here if push comes to shove. And it's been a good thing. I felt comfortable in that space. I think it's been good for us to sort of balance against the assumptions people make about us as a team. But I'm glad we've done that. I think it's been a healthy thing for us.
It has been a healthy thing, and it's important to name, too, that it is not like, I think, maybe 3 times over 30 years that it's been used. And it's, in my memory, and this is also something that when we work with groups, we say, want to think about, and we get some pushback because it is not the norm. But there's a level of trust on both sides of that because it feels good for me to be trusted to not just sort of arbitrarily say, well, no, Tobin, of course we're not going to do that. And because I have veto power, yes, you lose. I mean, to be trusted not to do that, right, says something about the principle in and of itself. It's not just a flip thing that I get to do, but it is part of the grounding of our friendship and partnership in the work that we do.
I mean, that third principle of it's not just about the work, I mean, is a way of saying we need to pause and tend to the community, tend to the relationships. Our sons, my sons now in their 30s, they just both got married this year, by the way. We have brilliant, wicked, smart daughters-in-law, but at any rate. They often talk about the modeling they saw in our community, the folks, the cohort of us, because we would get together, we'd share meals together, our families would be present. Our boys have relationships. Our boys know Regina. I know Regina's kids, and same way through that network. Because they knew that this was something that mattered to us, and it was formative for them. And I'm deeply grateful that they recognized that and treasured it as much as we did.
And one of the things, I mean, it's interesting you all talk about like the veto power not actually being used that much. But one of the things that I've always appreciated and why I'm excited, I don't know if everyone knows they're coming, they're doing a training for some of our leaders for the Thriving Together program tomorrow. But some of what I love is that you all, because of having worked through this over decades, like you also embody some of that just organically, you know, stepping forward, stepping back. Like I love to see how that actually plays out within your relationship, within the work that you all do together. I know we're going to have to land this plane, so Alex is going to get me soon. So maybe just the last question. I was going to ask you about, you know, dismantling racism versus challenging racists and all that kind of stuff, but they can just get that out of the book. So, but just thinking a little bit about, you know, what sustains you after all this time? What sustains you in the work that you do? I mean, you all are both still very involved on a multiplicity of ways in the work, and so what sustains you?
Community is by far critically important. Knowing that there are people that get what it is that I'm trying to do, we're trying to do. Um, the cohort of friends that we worked with back in the, especially in the 90s, when we were doing lots and lots and lots of anti-racism training, um, they it got used to me saying at the end of every training, I quit. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm just not doing it anymore. And in the moment, I would be serious, and then eventually it became a joke. Um, but there was also that sense of we are doing this together, and I need to show up. I need to show up for this cohort of people. I need to show up for the people who made it possible for me to be here. I think um, a lot about my ancestors. I think a lot about our spiritual ancestors and what they endured to make it possible for me. And I think of my kids and my grandchildren, 7 grandchildren, and I think about what I don't have a lot of power, but I do have some things that I that I can do, and that I still feel energized, and that is very sustaining.
I think the fundamental irony of our book is that we always come back to relationship, even though we're trying to address systemic change. And that's a tension that's in the book. I think it's just part of what emerges from the struggle. There's a story that we tell in brief in the book where I was caught in the midst of this national controversy where I was being pilloried in the Washington Post and all over the place. And I don't do criticism of me very well. I mean, I'm fine other direction, but I don't handle it very well. And there was a whole set of people that I was able to call and get strength from. Regina was one. Our friend Rick Dirksen was one. And Kulani Moore, and just sort of on, who had my back. And incredibly meaningful.
We're going to transition to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic.
Regina, I grew up hearing the song, Jesus Loves the Little Children, All the Children of the World. And I didn't start wincing when I heard it until I read your book. How long did it take you to get over wincing when you hear that?
I mean, I think I'm probably at the age now where things don't surprise me as much, and I think I also because I teach undergrads, right? So I spend a lot of time with people who are at a very different place on their journey than I am. And so I think that I try to hold a little bit of that, ooh, that's a thing. But also to recall the things that I didn't know about and to give grace. And that's a funny thing too, right? Because I think that often we have erred on the side of, well, they just don't know, or my favorite one is, well, it was a different time. It's like, yeah, in that different time, it was still wrong. So, um, but yeah, it's a journey.
Other questions?
Regina, I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about your experience when you said you left your church where you had a certain experience and then went out and had other experiences and that was like and how you adjusted.
Yeah. So my context of being Mennonite was being a black kid and then a black teen and then a black adult with white friends and with mixed friends, and these were people that I saw several times a week: Wednesday night choir practice, youth group, Sunday morning worship, and so it was my normal to think both about my racialized identity, my faith identity. Um, I grew up during I was a teenager in the 70s, and so civil rights movement, women's movement, all of those kinds of things were going on. And so this milieu of people speaking out about, talking about things, right? And when I realized, first of all, that there were very few black Mennonites, which I knew, like I wasn't dumb, but it was just like, oh, we are we are super rare. Like, um, especially, well, and let me just say, in the U.S. context, right? Not globally, of course. Um, but then to also come to realize that people had ideas about who I was as a Mennonite, which was, sort of like, well, who saved you, right? That kind of thing, which like was not my story at all. That was not my story at all. Um, so it was leaving, leaving for college. I went to a Mennonite college for just 1 year, and that was very jarring for me because people just did not know, that people assumed that the year that I was there was a big cohort of African American students from New York City and from Chicago, and a lot of them were my good friends. None of them were Mennonite, but it was very frustrating for people to keep explaining Mennonites to me, right? Or to just like, well, don't even bother about that. So I think as a young adult, that was more jarring. Um, when I started working for Mennonite institutions, and I have worked for many, it just became familiar, and I think too is part of the grounding for um, how do we think about ourselves. How do we think about ourselves as faith communities? How do we pull apart what it means to be um, to, to voluntarily be a part of a body rather than the assumption of a bloodline, just all of that kind of stuff, which is different for me than it is for you. Some of the questions are similar, but some of the ways that we work at it. So now I'm at a point where I'm at a Mennonite college, and most of my colleagues of color are not Mennonite. And sometimes I get the question of how have you been able to be here as long as you have, over 20 years? And part of my answer is I know how to be in this space, right? Which is not, it's a further conversation because I don't want it to be heard as you don't really belong here or you don't know how to be here. But it's just like I have a unique, like I know how to be here. for various reasons, um, and and part of those reasons are things need to change about how institutions um, are truly of community, regardless of denominational status and that sort of thing.
Um, we're an interracial couple, if you can't tell. And we've been married 40 years, raised our girls as Christians. And I always thought I would be leaving the world a better place for them than when we first started out. And that's kind of not the case. And in fact, one of our daughters, in seeing the racism in the church, has decided not to be a Christian anymore, and that breaks my heart. And I don't know how to reach out to her. Do you have any suggestions? And, my feeling is she says she doesn't, if those are the people who are going to be in heaven, then I don't want to be there. And so, any suggestions?
I want to speak to this as well, but one of the I will say, I have had those thoughts myself, and I think that for me, I have had to trust that I did what I could and do what I can for my children, and they get to make their decisions. But also, to just sort of loop back to an earlier part of this conversation, it is why I keep wanting to have these conversations, because it matters for exactly what you have named. Um, that the reality of people's experiences have made many people say, "Yeah, not for me. That's not for me." So I think that it spurs us on as faith communities to say we don't dare stop doing this work. Thank you.
And the thing I would add, I don't know that this would be effective for your daughter. When that kind of conversation comes my way, one of my responses is simply to say, to be frank, open, and honest about the history of the church, that what we're seeing now in certain sectors of the Christian community is not a new thing, it's a resurgence. And one of the things we argue in the book is that that's going to continue to cycle until we have a reckoning. And we have not had that reckoning in most parts of the Christian community. And until that happens, we'll see this cycling again and again.
Thank you for being here.
Can you all?
Yeah, I know. A little closer. I grew up Mennonite, went to a Mennonite college. I'm not Mennonite anymore, really, or at least I don't go to a Mennonite college, but it's in my blood on some level. What would a reckoning look like? How would we get to a reckoning is one question. And if I can ask two, I came in looking at the bios and wondered about Tobin, your ability to work as a professor of African American studies. And initially my feeling was like, ooh, I don't know if that feels good to me. And then I was like, but in Montana, and then, and so it was just this like struggle for me.
Sorry.
So I wonder if you would talk to both of those questions.
Maybe I'll jump into the second part first. Oh, yeah. So, Montana. First day of every class that I teach at University of Montana, I say to the room, I want you to know that I know I'm white. There's no confusion there. And then I use that as a launching point to tell the process that I went through with my African American colleagues very deliberately, intentionally, when this job was in front of me. and asked, Regina was obviously the first person I had that conversation, would it have integrity for me to do this? And I also tell my students, there will always be a tension with me in this job. There should be a tension with me in this job. Let's explore that together and see what we can figure out. Because I'm also, the argument I make is that African American history should be something that everybody knows about and that we are all passionate about. I've had gracious students through the 16 years I've taught UM who've invited me in that space. The other thing to know, Missoula, Montana, even though we are not the whitest state in the union, Montana, we are the least black. But that said, there's a very active Montana Black collective that I'm very closely connected to that is organized. They put on our Juneteenth celebration. They hold me accountable for the work I do in the classroom. I bring them into the classroom. So great question, always should be asked. It's working for us at this point. And we are, by the way, University of Montana's African American Studies program is the country's third oldest. So I can tell you that story sometime if you're interested. Really fascinating story. I am totally forgetting in the first part of your question. Oh, yes, reckoning. Do you want to speak to that first? Well, I can jump into it. Reckonings are always specific. They are honest, and there is some kind of real concrete, I mean, reparations is the easiest word to bring into the conversation as a result of that process. So I think there are reckonings that need to happen for a denomination. There are reckonings that need to happen for particular institutions who have had troubled pasts around this. And there needs to be a real concrete manifestation of that at the end. I'm going to call Drew out for a second, but he's working on a book that's going to address reparations issues, and that's going to be an important text. That's a big part of it. But again, concrete, specific, and has a result.
And none of that can happen if people can't talk about race. And so a huge part of, I think, what we do together and do outside of the academy, but certainly this is true for me in the academy, in my classrooms, like getting people to normalize conversations about race where people are not screaming at each other or are not afraid to say things to each other. Like you can say the word. I was just your first day of class speech about whiteness. I remember back in the early 2010s, the aughts as we call them. I used to have to sort of work my way up to talking about whiteness in the classroom. Now it's very different because I think many parts of conversations about race have become normalized. Like people may not be used to the words coming out of their mouths, but they've heard it before. I think social media is a big part of that. Just normalizing, this is something that we can actually talk about and we will be fine most of the time. And the times when we are not fine, then we figure out how to get back to being okay about it.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Are you okay shouting up from up there?
I think so. It's work, right? But this is one of the places where in faith communities, like we got whole sermons about that, right? It's that thing of, are we for real? Like if we say this is what we believe and this is who we follow, are we for real about that? And I think that there's a way of loving enemies that can be self-aggrandizing, right? It can be like heroic. it's work. It's work. And for me, I'm in peace studies, and so I get to be thinking a lot about how to talk across lines of difference in ways that are outside of thinking about social identities, but they're never really outside because we carry them with us. And so I think that the awareness of that, of not being afraid of it, we are socialized quite heavily in this country to not notice, like how many of us grew up with color blindness and all of that, and which is it seems fine, but it doesn't help us be able to do what you're asking about in an authentic way. I think that a big part of that is we have to do it um, and find our way towards it. In conflict studies, we talk about so we're talking about an interpersonal conflict. Um, you separate the people from the problem, right? And so recognizing that the person that is in front of me that wrote that thing or said that thing or did that thing or is engaged in that thing, um, this is not all of who they are, which is really, really hard when the part of who they are is actively hurting my community. Like, that's a very difficult thing to do, which is one of the reasons that I, you know, have thought very carefully, what is my primary work and where do I do it? And for me, it's mostly in the classroom because that's a place where I was about to say I don't have to face people who want to say those things to me, but that's not true. But I think that my experience in the classroom and in workshop settings with those kinds of encounters that are in your face, where people are telling me that my experience is wrong, or I don't understand, or it was a different time, or whatever it is, I need to figure out how to ground myself in that moment, think about what it is that I actually want to do and how do I want to get there. And honestly, sometimes it's like that is not my work. So this is the last thing that I'll say on that. A few years ago, when I was feeling like my life was out of control with me doing too many things, one of the boundaries that I set was I don't do Racism 101 except in the classroom. Like, if somebody wants to invite me to come to their group to tell their group why racism is a problem, like, I'm not your girl for that. I don't that because other people will do that. Other people have done that. There's books, y'all, and my blood pressure personally can't take it. So
I'll just a real quick anecdote. About 6 years ago, I was put on professor watch list by a group called Turning Point. Apparently, I'm the most dangerous professor in the entire state of Montana.
you really are.
That's what it is. And in response to that, to get your question, I made a public offer to take out anyone from that organization or who agreed with that organization for a beer. What got the attention was that I was willing to talk with people who I didn't agree with, but as a Mennonite, that was easy. It was getting the beer part that was the frightening thing. Some really good exchanges came out of that. Opening myself to talking with someone. I had no agenda there. I didn't try to convince them of anything, but at least in one particular place, memorable night in a bar, had a very good connection with someone. Even though he didn't know, there were 8 people in the bar who were so worried about me that they were incognito, there ready to jump in if the guy was going to beat me up. But it was a good exchange.
You mentioned the tension in the book between relational and systemic, and going back and forth on that. And I'm wondering if you could just expand a bit on your insights for how to maybe balance that tension. And I'm thinking about both in a church or faith-based body, where you're talking about particular relationships as well as anti-racist practice and spirituality for that institution or group, or however you frame it, and the balance with our personal community and recognizing the world that we want to create for the broader community and any kind of political, whether that is governmental political or other types of political action. And yeah, just how you might navigate that tension or what insights you have for that.
Three quick things. Circling around to the point we began with, that I think rather than positing the relationship as the point to pursue, but seeing that the relationships emerge out of the struggle covers over a world of hurt. Because you simply aren't going down that pathway which, to name the evangelical community in particular, has pursued for decades, and it has failed miserably to do any substantive change in our race relations in this country, to simply say we have to have friends across racial lines. That changes the frame. I think that's really important. The other is, we would tell groups when they were beginning to face some of the realities of the work they were doing, that the wells go deeper as the struggle gets harder. And we drink from those wells together. It's the same message: collectivity, group, working together. I'll stop there. That's enough.
It's helpful for me to think, and this grows out of the work that we do with groups. Like, what's your mission? Who are you? And constantly calling ourselves back to our missions. We can do it as families, we can do it as classrooms, we can do it as institutions, and relationships grow out of that. But it's also it's a way of again, separating the people from the problem, right? If this is our mission, then what is the most faithful action to take to our mission? Is a helpful way to pull it away from, because it can get mired down in personality conflicts and that sort of thing. And so having a common goal, a common thing that we have agreed, like nobody made you, well, maybe they did, but for me, that's always a helpful, like, framing to do it in.
We've got to wrap up, but can we give our authors one last round of applause? Just one last thank you to Drew for helping organize this. Thank you to Regina and Tobin. We have books available for sale up at the cafe. Regina and Tobin are sticking around for a book signing. We also have Drew's books up there. They are signed as well. But thanks so much for coming out. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. This was a really wonderful evening, and have a good night.
Thank you so much.
I know, so